Congregation swearing an oath of innocence. I heard a case one time where a judge said to a person, well, yeah, you're guilty. We have 2 reliable witnesses who saw you do it. And the accused person said, well, Your Honor, give me time and I'll produce 20 reliable witnesses who will swear that they didn't see me do it. As if that would have proven anything.
No, you go like the lie detector test.
Anyway, all right. The church. I ought to move on. The church became organized. At first, at the lowest level, and this is still true, at the lowest level of authority you had the priest. All right. And then above the priest, you eventually had bishops. The bishop was over several priests. Now later in time, as time went on, you had above the bishops was placed the archbishop, and then really, really later was placed the cardinal. Now, we had the top office, the pope. Constantine appointed 4 bishops. Now some history books will say 5, but he appointed a bishop for Rome, a bishop at Constantinople, a bishop at Alexandria, and a bishop at Jerusalem. And some will say a bishop at Antioch. But anyway, be that as it may, he appointed some bishops. Eventually, the Bishop of Rome said that he was the top head of all of the others. This was recognized here in the West. It has not been recognized in the East, and led to the Eastern and Western churches splitting in 2. Now, the Bishop of Rome eventually became what we know of as the Pope, which comes from the Latin word papa, or Pope. Pope claims that he's the head of all the church. The Eastern people do not recognize that. And not weird, but it's interesting enough. When the church picked its last pope in February of last year, about 21 months ago, the new pope said, I don't want to ever forget that I'm also Bishop of Rome. It seemed like all the popes have temporarily for time forgotten that, but he said, I'm not just Pope of the church, I'm also Bishop of Rome, which he wants to make sure we remember. Now, what made the Pope so powerful was, as the political system dwindled, as kings began to become weak and ineffective and lost their authority, the Pope was the one strong man of the hour. And then we had a Pope Leo who persuaded Attila not to attack Rome, and this greatly enhanced the prestige of the Pope. The church began to take over granting marriage licenses, performing marriage ceremonies, and performing baptisms, getting people to join, and first one thing after another, until the church became the most powerful institution in the Middle Ages, and it was to remain so up until the time of the Protestant Reformation in the 1500s. In the church, they began to organize themselves, not just in terms of clergy, but a bunch of men would get together, and first they lived by themselves, then they got together and lived in communities. They were called monks. The monks would live in a monastery, headed up by an abbot. Eventually some women decided they would do the same, so they called themselves nuns. They lived in a convent, and they were headed up by an abbess. Today we tend to think, we use the term Mother Superior more than we do abbess. The monks took a vow of 3 things, and folk, it's been said that what you miss on a test, you remember, I missed this on a fill-in-the-blank test. I made 1 C in a history class the entire time I was in college, and that C was where the teacher gave fill-in-the-blank test, and I was used to multiple choice. But anyway, leaving that, the monks took 3 vows, and nuns: poverty, chastity, and obedience. I know I'd have gotten that right had I seen it on the multiple choice test, but again, to each his own. My vow of poverty meant that they would promise never to own anything. Frequently they slept on wooden beds with wooden pillows, and maybe 1 little coarse burlap sack or blanket. Very impoverished, and ate very, very rough food. Chastity meant they would never engage in any kind of sex, was never marry. Obedience, they would always obey their abbot, or they're sometimes called a rector. As time went on, they began to assist more in the community. The monasteries became a combination of the Middle Ages libraries, schools, hospitals, meeting places, you might say community centers. They served a function that was later on divided up and taken over by other parts of the community. Sometimes they would help people who were too sick to work. They'd go out and work as farm foremen. They also spent a lot of time copying old manuscripts, and they are credited with preserving the Bible through the Dark Ages, as well as preserving the writings of Plato, the writings of Aristotle, the writings of Anaximander, Thales, and Thucydides, and Xenophon. They would get an old manuscript and copy it onto new parchment, and this went on for hundreds of years. Oftentimes they had little idea what they were copying. They just simply copied what they were told. But they preserved a lot of writing and a lot of learning down through the period. Now, your book doesn't use the term Dark Ages, folks, but I grew up with that term, so I guess I'm using it for that reason. But learning, the light of learning was pretty dim during this period of time. But what little learning there was occurred here. In fact, as I'm going to mention in a few minutes, Charlemagne never even learned how to read, and he was the emperor of the most powerful kingdom in Europe and never learned reading. One of the more prominent founders of monasteries was Saint Benedict. He was the one who sat down and wrote the rules for monasticism, as the church felt like had defined what it believed and how a monk should live and what the monks consist of. Monks were known for their tonsures, that is where they shaved the top of their hair. You see a picture of that on page 331. Shave the top of their head, but let their hair grow on the side. This was called a tonsure. And you see several monks with a tonsure on page 331. Some monks, though, had a different kind of tonsure. All right. We have 3 minutes left. We go back to Charlemagne again. Charlemagne realized to govern his empire, he needed help, so he sent up people, his best trusted servants called counts. A count was over an area called a county, but then he realized he had a problem. He would tell one of his faster horsemen, now I want you to go tell the count of so-and-so to do thus and such. Well, by the time the messenger carried the order to the count, and it came back to Charlemagne, there was oftentimes a whole lot of misunderstanding. Well, finally, Charlemagne said, I need to write this down. You know, he himself could neither read nor write. So he called in a scribe and said to the scribe, I want you to write down this, tell Count such and such that he must do thus and so. He'd give the piece of paper to his messenger, and the messenger would carry the paper with the orders. And by written orders, supposedly Charlemagne achieved more obedience to his command, because there's a little bit of power in a written page, called the printed page. Now, maybe none of you have ever worked at a factory, but I've worked at 2 factories in my lifetime, actually 3. And they have a thing called an ANVO, an ANVO, which means accept no verbal orders. In other words, make sure that the boss, what he wants, writes down what he wants. Only then are you obligated to obey it. Or if you want something from your bosses, you write it down, and only then is your boss obligated to act on it. It's called an ANVO. Any of you ever heard of it? ANVO? Maybe some of you will never see the inside of a factory, but we use them a lot at Lockheed. Accept no verbal orders. Again, Charlemagne, realizing the value of reading, Charlemagne set up a school for noble children only, and this school is believed to be the beginning of the public education system in Europe. When he realized that young noble boys, at least boys, not girls, noble boys should learn how to read and write, even though he himself could do neither one. I'm going to have to stop here and take a break with Charlemagne. Anybody have any comments, questions? Again, I erased it. Don't forget the papers are due. I'm going to check tomorrow morning and see who has them. The ones who have them, fine. And ones who don't, I'm going to knock off 5 points. All right, I'll see you Wednesday.